right, so let's go ahead and talk about a core question that ended up going ahead and being put in. All right. So what ended up getting asked was, all right, I ended up going to court. I ended up winning a settlement, but the person that the judgment was against made it very clear that they have no intentions to be paying the total of the judgment ward. How do I go ahead and make them pay? All right. Here's, what ended up getting mentioned as an answer in that question was, get Marshall to go ahead and order with, getting their account number to seize their bank accounts. All right. Now that right there, obviously somebody's bank account numbers, not exactly common knowledge, unless you in some way or another are financially tied in with them. There's another way. All right. A completely legal way. All right. There was a judgment in someone's favor, and ultimately the person that the judgment was against basically has the attitude of, good luck making me pay. You could put what's called a mechanic lien. All right. Now with that mechanic lien, ultimately, you can go ahead and seize their real property until they pay. All right. Now, I know you're going to ask, now, what property could be seized? I mean, think of it as a repossession. All right. So, technically, there is a large amount and a small amount. All right. So, let's say, for example, there's a judgment where, some of my family members that wanted to go ahead and bring a situation to court and wanted to try to dodge and keep the information from me, that I ended up winning in a court case because they had every intention to try to force me into a conservatorship, get guardianship of me, and extort that money out of me. Now, what I can do, like I clarified in that last video, I could go ahead and call Adult Protective Services. Adult Protective Services will go ahead and appoint a lawyer for me to go ahead and speak up. A financial advisor will go ahead and check the bank accounts of everyone involved, including everyone that has, been going ahead and bouncing the money back and forth to each other. Now, keep in mind, whoever, there was any type of wire transfers to or anything, that person will get investigated. And if they've made any wire transfers to anyone, that person that they ended up doing the transfer to will end up getting investigated, so on and so forth. It'll just make this giant web of a whole bunch of people's bank accounts getting investigated. All right. But technically, you could go ahead and use that mechanic's lien. All right. Do they own their home? All right. Technically, if there's a judgment against them, you could go ahead and use that mechanic lien to go ahead and take possession of their home. You go ahead and clarify. Oh, you want your home back, huh? So, you want to be a homeowner again. You want to be able to be like, my house, my rules. Well, then pay your fucking bills. And because of trying to defraud me, I'm going to be charging interest. It'll be at a conscionable amount of interest, because I understand that if it's an unconscionable amount, that ultimately, if this needs to go and be litigated, that the judgment will end up going ahead and working against me, because at that point, then I might end up going ahead and getting charged with extortion, and that'll put a very bad look on my end, and ultimately it'll look like the asshole regardless. So, it'll be a conscionable amount of interest, But, technically, throughout the time that I have that mechanic's lien on your home, that is my home. All right? Ultimately, you are living under my house. So technically, you have to abide by my rules. And ultimately, another factor to remember, while it is my house, I am in legal right to go ahead and do whatever I want to do with my house. So let's say, for example, I end up putting a mechanic's lien because of the factor of there being a judgment against you, that leaned in my favor. And technically, that home is now my home, regardless of the amount. Now, keep in mind, literally, you could do this and go ahead and get the person's home for a very low price. Now, keep in mind, you have to make sure, obviously, that they're completely, that home and everything throughout the duration is completely caught up when it comes to the property taxes and everything, because otherwise you could end up going ahead and eating the tax fraud charge for the other asshole that wanted to try to defraud the bank and leave you on the hook for the taxes that they were trying to dodge. All right? You don't want to end up in that situation, because ultimately you'll be giving somebody else a free house where your house will be prison. So, that being said, with that mechanic's lien, what can you do? Well, ultimately, the amount of equity that ends up going ahead and being in that home, ultimately, I'd be free to do whatever the fuck I want with that home. So, let's say, for example, technically, keep in mind, I'd be within legal right, all right? So, technically, if I wanted to go ahead and burn down the house, all right, legally, that arson would not be considered a felony. All right. Now, keep in mind, in order for that to be the case, you would have to have every single safety protocol absolutely ready. All right. To go ahead and have that house burning down to be considered a demolition. All right. And in order for it to be a demolition, it would need to be a controlled burn. So in order for it to be a controlled burn, you would have to go ahead and get the permitting and the approval from, the chief of, or the fire marshal of your local county, to go ahead and approve said action, But technically, if you wanted to burn it down, if you were burning it down as a demolition, and you were not collecting any form of insurance claim on said home, and it being a demolition and a controlled burn demolition, you have not broken any laws. All right? So I'm saying this is the levels of fucked up that people could end up doing with a judgment against them. So ultimately, the question you want to ask yourself is, do you really want to risk not going ahead and paying a judgment that the courts ended up saying that you owe that person, because of whatever you ended up going ahead and breaching? Like, say, for example, you ended up going ahead and trying to commit wage theft. You employed somebody, you didn't want to pay them, based on the Fair Standard Labor Act. So ultimately, you went and you had them working for you, wanted to label them an independent contractor, but you did not go ahead and actually go and give them the amount that was supposed to be given. That is the federal minimum, at the least, the bare minimum, all right? Nor the market, value of the job. Ultimately, as the employer, you will go ahead and accrue a massive amount of fines. I believe it is $10,000 in infraction. So ultimately, that right there is a no-no. But yeah, that right there is the start of where someone could do. Because ultimately, understand, if that ends up happening too, because you also have to prove the debt, all right? And we're talking prove the amount of the debt, all right? And we're not talking with the, with an insane compounded interest rate, because ultimately a predatory compounded interest rate, not going ahead and looking at, the annual percentage yield that would end up being accrued through interest, ultimately, there are factors that if it's a business going ahead and doing it to a person, whether the business ends up being a landlord, whether it ends up being, a corporation, a company, that went to go price gouge ultimately, you have protections when it comes to the Federal Debt Collection Act, as well as the Consumer Protection Act. So, there are safeguards to be able to go ahead and protect you. All right. But ultimately, if you do not go ahead and pay that debt off at the point that the, courts end up going ahead and saying, you have to go ahead, the timer is starting now. All right. You owe a lot of money. You owe money. And it doesn't matter if it's a small amount of money or if it's a large amount of money. Because understand too, trying to pressure somebody into reducing or forgiving a debt, ultimately, that right there, not only considered tortious interference, but also it is considered, witness intimidation. So ultimately, that right there could end up going ahead and working against you in a court of law. Now, keep in mind, arbitration, something totally different. Ultimately, if you end up choosing to forego court and choose the arbitration route, then understand with arbitration, you have waived the right to be considered a quote-unquote witness, all right? Which means that ultimately, if I want to go intimidate the fuck out of you, there's not a goddamn thing legally you could do about it. But with that mechanics lien, could also go ahead and put that mechanics lien to, say for example, send that information to the Department of Transportation, and that could get your license suspended, all right? Because at that point, it's considered a legal bond, all right? And that legal bond ultimately needs to go ahead and be remedied at whatever, cost necessary. So there will be infractions that end up going ahead and be put in place to make your life awfully fucking inconvenient. And ultimately you will take financial losses, undue burden. It's just, it is sticky as fuck. You do not want to go down that route. You do not want to tempt that fate. Because understand, tempting that fate, ooh, that is one that doesn't come out pretty,